When I arrived at my brother's wedding, my seat was a stool by the exit. No meal, no place card, no recognition. His wife's family whispered, "He's just the backup son." So I hurried out with the $4,500 check I'd slipped in their card box. 15 minutes later, I heard him yelling down the hall. Where is he? I, 31M, never expected my brother's wedding to become the moment everything changed between us forever. The venue was one of those upscale places with marble floors and crystal chandeliers that cost more than most people's cars. I'd driven 4 hours to get there, wearing my best suit and carrying a card with a check that represented 2 months of overtime shifts at the plant. My brother and I weren't close, but he was family, and family shows up. The moment I walked into the reception hall, I knew something was wrong. Every table had elegant place cards with gold lettering, white linens, and centerpieces that probably cost more than my monthly rent. I searched for my name among the carefully arranged seating chart by the entrance. Table after table, I looked for any sign that I belonged here. My name wasn't anywhere. A wedding coordinator with a clipboard and a stressed expression approached me. She explained that there had been some confusion with the seating arrangements, but they'd found me a spot. She led me to the very back of the room, near the kitchen doors and the emergency exit. There sat a simple wooden stool, the kind servers used during their breaks. No tablecloth, no centerpiece, no place card, just a stool that looked like it had been grabbed from storage 5 minutes earlier. I stood there for a moment, processing what I was seeing. Around me, guests in expensive clothes chatted and laughed at their perfectly appointed tables. The bride's family filled the front section, their tables adorned with premium floral arrangements and upgraded glassware. Even distant relatives I'd never seen before had proper seats with their names written in calligraphy. But the moment that really hit me was when I overheard a conversation behind me. 3 women from the bride's family were discussing the seating arrangements, their voices carrying just enough for me to catch every word. The oldest one mentioned how they'd had to make room for so many important guests. The younger one asked about the man sitting alone in the back, gesturing toward me. That's when the middle-aged woman said it. "Oh, that's just the backup son. You know how some families have the important child and then the spare? He's the spare." They laughed softly, as if sharing an inside joke about family dynamics they'd observed before. The backup son, the spare. 28 years of being second choice distilled into 2 casual phrases that cut deeper than any argument we'd ever had. I sat on that stool and watched my brother at the head table, surrounded by the bride's family, laughing and raising toasts with people who clearly mattered more than I did. He looked happy, genuinely happy, in a way I hadn't seen since we were kids. But he also looked comfortable with this arrangement, like my relegation to furniture near the exit was perfectly acceptable. The dinner service began, and I watched servers carry plates of what smelled like prime rib and lobster to every table. They walked past me repeatedly, never making eye contact, never offering me anything. I wasn't on the catering list. I wasn't part of the meal plan. I was just there, occupying space on borrowed furniture. That's when I made the decision. I stood up from my stool and walked calmly to the gift table. The card box was elegant cream silk with pearl accents, probably chosen to match the bride's dress. I reached inside and found my card easily enough. It was one of the thicker envelopes because of the check inside. $4,500. Money I'd saved for months, thinking about how proud I'd be to give my brother a generous wedding gift. Money that represented working doubles every weekend for the past 3 months, turning down dates and social events, eating ramen for dinner more nights than I cared to count. I slipped the card into my jacket pocket and walked toward the exit. Not the main entrance where guests were still arriving, but the side door near my stool that led directly to the parking lot. The emergency exit, as it turned out, was exactly where I needed to be. My car was parked in the back lot, where the less important guests had been directed. I sat in my driver's seat for a moment, looking at the card in my hands. Inside was a check with my brother's name on it, and a note I'd written that morning about hoping for his happiness and wishing him the best life had to offer. I tore up both the check and the note, letting the pieces fall onto my passenger seat, like confetti from a celebration I was never really invited to join. As I started my engine, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not anger, exactly, but clarity. Relief, even. For years, I convinced myself that our distance was just one of those things that happens between siblings as they grow up. Different interests, different paths, different priorities. But this wasn't about growing apart. This was about never having mattered in the first place. I was pulling out of the parking lot when I heard it, shouting from inside the venue. Even through the closed doors and windows, the voice was unmistakably my brother's, raised in what sounded like panic or anger. I couldn't make out words, but the tone was clear. Something had gone very wrong very quickly. 15 minutes. That's how long it had taken for someone to notice the missing envelope. Maybe they were doing the traditional money count that some couples do during their reception. Maybe the bride's family had insisted on cataloging gifts as they arrived. Maybe my brother had specifically asked about my contribution, expecting it to help offset the wedding costs. I drove home that night with my phone buzzing constantly in my cup holder. Text after text, call after call, but I didn't answer any of them. I had nothing left to say to someone who thought a stool by the exit was good enough for his brother. Update 1. The calls didn't stop for 3 days. My brother left voicemails that progressed from confused to angry to something approaching desperation. He wanted to know where I'd gone, why I'd left, and most importantly, what had happened to my gift. He never mentioned the seating arrangement. He never acknowledged that maybe there was a reason I'd left early. On the 4th day, he showed up at my apartment. I opened the door to find him still wearing his wedding shoes, though he'd changed into jeans and a polo shirt. He looked like he hadn't slept much, and there was something in his expression I'd never seen before, genuine worry. He asked if he could come in, and I stepped aside to let him pass. My apartment was small and simple, nothing like the house he'd bought with his new wife in the suburbs. He stood in my living room looking around like he was seeing how I lived for the first time, which, I realized, he probably was. He wanted to know what had happened at the wedding. He said people had been asking where I'd gone, that our parents were worried, that his new wife was upset about the whole situation. He mentioned the gift almost as an afterthought, like it wasn't the real reason he was there, but I could tell it was eating at him. I told him about the stool. I described finding my seat among the kitchen staff's spare furniture while his wife's distant cousins got premium table assignments. I mentioned the conversation I'd overheard, the casual dismissal of me as the backup son, the spare. His face changed as I talked, not to anger or defensiveness, but to something that looked like genuine surprise. He claimed he hadn't known about the seating arrangement, that his wife and her mother had handled all those details. He said he'd assumed I was at one of the family tables, that he'd been too busy with wedding activities to check on everyone individually. But then he said something that revealed everything. He mentioned that they'd had to make some tough choices about seating because the bride's family was large and had specific requirements about who sat where. Important business connections, family politics, that sort of thing. He said it like it was obvious that I would understand being moved to accommodate more important people. That's when I realized he wasn't sorry about what had happened. He was sorry that I'd reacted badly to what had happened. In his mind, my response was the problem, not the treatment that had caused it. I asked him a simple question. If the situation were reversed, if I'd gotten married and seated him on a stool by the kitchen while giving premium spots to people he'd never met, how would he have felt? He was quiet for a long time. Then he said something about how that was different, how my situation wasn't the same as his. He didn't explain what made it different, but he didn't need to. We both knew what he meant. I told him about the check then, about the $4,500 I'd been planning to give them. His eyes widened when I mentioned the amount. It was more than he'd expected, probably more than anyone else had given them. I explained how I'd saved that money, what it had cost me to set it aside, how proud I'd been to give them such a generous gift. Then I told him I'd taken it back. Update 2. The conversation that followed was unlike any we'd ever had. My brother's reaction to learning about the money was immediate and intense. Not anger, exactly, but something closer to panic. He started talking about wedding expenses, about how much everything had cost, about deposits and vendors and family expectations. It became clear that he and his new wife had been counting on wedding gifts to help offset their costs. The venue, the catering, the flowers, the photography, they'd gone significantly over budget, betting that gift money would make up the difference. My contribution wasn't just expected, it was needed. He asked if I would reconsider, if we could work something out. He suggested that maybe there had been a misunderstanding about the seating, that it could be fixed for future family events. He promised that his wife would apologize, that her family would be more welcoming going forward. But he never apologized himself. Not once during that entire conversation did he acknowledge that what had happened was wrong, or that my feelings were valid, or that I had been treated poorly by people who were supposed to care about me. Instead, he kept circling back to practical concerns. The money they needed, the awkwardness of explaining to his wife's family why a promised gift hadn't materialized, the difficulty of their financial situation in those first months of marriage. I realized something important during that conversation. My brother had never seen me as a person with feelings that could be hurt. I was a resource to be managed, a relationship to be maintained for practical purposes, a family member who would always be there regardless of how he treated me. The backup son, the spare, the one who would show up, contribute what was expected, and accept whatever level of consideration was convenient to offer. I told him I needed time to think about everything. He left that day looking defeated, but I could tell he expected me to come around eventually. That's what I'd always done before. Accepted less than I deserved, made excuses for his behavior, prioritized family harmony over my own dignity. 2 weeks later, I got a call from our mother. She'd heard about the wedding situation from my brother, though his version of events was considerably different from what had actually happened. In his telling, there had been a simple misunderstanding about seating arrangements, and I'd overreacted by leaving early and taking back my gift. She wanted me to be the bigger person, to reach out and smooth things over. She talked about family unity, about not letting pride get in the way of important relationships, about how weddings are stressful times when mistakes happen. I asked her if she knew where I'd been seated at the wedding. She admitted she didn't know the specific details, but she was sure it hadn't been intentional. I described the stool, the location by the exit, the lack of meal service, the comments from the bride's family. There was a long silence on the phone. Then she asked if I was sure I'd heard those comments correctly, if maybe I'd misunderstood the situation, if perhaps I'd been looking for reasons to be offended. That conversation helped me understand something crucial. This pattern wasn't just between my brother and me. It was a family system where I was expected to absorb poor treatment and respond with grace, where my reactions to being mistreated were seen as more problematic than the mistreatment itself. Update 3. 3 months after the wedding, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I stopped trying to maintain relationships that only worked when I was willing to accept less than I deserved. My brother had continued reaching out periodically, usually when he needed something or when family events were approaching. His messages followed a predictable pattern: brief mentions of missing me, followed by invitations to gatherings or requests for help with various projects. Never apologies, never acknowledgement of what had happened, never recognition that anything needed to be addressed before we could move forward. I stopped responding to those messages, not out of anger, but out of clarity about what those relationships actually were and what they were likely to become. The breaking point came during Thanksgiving planning. My mother called to discuss dinner arrangements, and she mentioned that my brother and his wife would be hosting this year. She said they were excited to have everyone over to their new house, that it would be a fresh start for family gatherings. Then she mentioned, almost casually, that they were planning to seat everyone at a large table they bought specifically for entertaining. Everyone except me. I would be at a smaller card table in the adjoining room because the main table only seated 10 and there were 11 family members expected. The backup son, relegated to auxiliary furniture once again. I told my mother I wouldn't be attending Thanksgiving. She was shocked, then hurt, then angry. She accused me of holding grudges, of being unreasonable, of punishing the whole family for one misunderstanding at a wedding. But it wasn't one misunderstanding. It was a pattern of behavior that had been going on for years, maybe decades, that I'd finally learned to recognize. The wedding had just been the moment when that pattern became impossible to ignore or excuse. I spent Thanksgiving alone that year, cooking a small meal for myself and watching football. It was quiet, peaceful, and honest in a way that family gatherings hadn't been for a long time. I wasn't performing gratitude for treatment I didn't appreciate, wasn't pretending that surface-level pleasantries constituted meaningful relationships, wasn't accepting scraps and calling them meals. 6 months later, I heard through extended family that my brother and his wife were having financial difficulties. The wedding debt had been larger than expected, and they were struggling to keep up with mortgage payments on the house they'd bought. Some family members suggested that maybe I should reach out, offer to help, put aside past differences for the sake of family unity. I didn't reach out, not because I wanted them to struggle, but because I'd learned an important lesson about the difference between being helpful and being used. The same people who had found my seating arrangement acceptable were now suggesting I should ignore my own boundaries to solve problems I hadn't created. A year after the wedding, I got a text message from my brother. It was brief, just a few lines about missing our relationship and wondering if we could talk. No mention of what had happened, no acknowledgement of why we weren't talking, no indication that he understood what would need to change for us to have a different kind of relationship. I thought about responding for several days. I drafted messages explaining how I felt, outlining what would need to happen for us to rebuild trust, describing the kind of relationship I would be willing to have going forward. But in the end, I realized that someone who still didn't understand why I'd left his wedding reception probably wasn't ready for the kind of honest conversation that would be required to move forward. Some relationships can't be fixed because the people in them don't agree that they're broken. I deleted the message without responding. 2 years later, I'm living a quieter life with fewer family obligations and more authentic relationships. I've learned to recognize the difference between people who value me and people who value what I provide. I've stopped showing up to events where I'm treated like an afterthought, stopped giving generous gifts to people who don't appreciate them, stopped making myself small to accommodate others' comfort. The backup son doesn't exist anymore. There's just me, setting boundaries that protect my dignity and choosing relationships that add value to my life rather than drain it. Sometimes I wonder if my brother ever figured out why I really left that reception. Sometimes I think about the $4,500 and whether he learned anything from losing it. Sometimes I consider what might have happened if he'd simply acknowledged that I deserved better treatment and committed to making sure it never happened again. But mostly, I'm grateful for that wooden stool by the exit. It showed me exactly where I stood in relationships I'd been taking for granted, and it gave me the clarity to walk away from people who didn't value my presence enough to offer me a proper seat at their table. That stool was the best wedding gift I ever received, even though it wasn't intended as one. It taught me that sometimes the most important person to show up for is yourself.